Hello and welcome to a new webcast from the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. My name is Hussein Askary. Today is Saturday, May the 31st. As everybody knows, the United States and China reached a certain agreement in Geneva on May the 12th after a very dramatic battle, the Tariffs war, which went on for a couple of months. Which almost brought the whole transatlantic financial and banking system down and caused enormous confusion and disruption of supply chains on a global scale. When President Trump, specifically on April the 2nd, declared the Liberation Day and imposed tariffs on the whole world, including on islands where populated only by penguins. So, but gradually, the United States had to back down, and especially in relationship to China. So we have today to discuss that question. Old friend, Warwick Powell, Professor Warwick Powell, Queensland University of Technology and Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute in China. You are based in Australia right now. He is the author of a number of works, including the book, China, Trust and Digital Supply Chains, Dynamics of a Zero Trust World. But for people who are interested, they can contact him. We will have the contact to your website and how to communicate with you later. Welcome, Warwick.
It's great to be back with you, Hussein.
Thank you very much. The last time we talked was like 3 months ago, before this whole new phase of the tariff war started, but there was already some tariff issues, 10% and reciprocated by China. We discussed actually already then that the United States is not in a very good position and there will be consequences. But after Liberty Day, you made a forecast the day after Trump announced his tariffs on the whole planet, but then later also escalating against China. But you made a forecast. You wrote an article on Substack where you said, and that was, I think, the 3rd of April, the day after, you said the US simply doesn't have the leverage that it once did in the world of global trade. Its market is a little less than 15% of the global imports and falling. The world has already been moving on. Now is the time to accelerate. And then you leave a room for regret, where you say there's a place at the table for the United States if it accepts the new realities of the world and joins a multilateral world, the new world order, we can say. So my question is, there's 2 questions. As we said, there are no winners in trade wars and even in wars. There are losers. And the United States obviously lost the tariff war with China. They had to back down and reach a settlement with China. And President Trump in the beginning was waiting for President Xi to call him. And President Xi didn't do that. On the contrary, Chinese officials and the Commerce Ministry responded to Trump by imposing tariffs on American goods. The question is that why you thought the United States would lose the trade war, and then we have a question about how that happened. And of course, there's a question of method, which I would like to, there were many memes about these 2 books in international and social media. There's a question of method between the Chinese and the American way of doing things today, which we want to discuss later. So first question, Warwick, why did you say the United States is going to lose this battle?
Look, it's amazing that it's 3 months already or more since we last spoke at how time flies. And it's hard to keep track sometimes of all of these goings on, particularly as there is a lot of change from a day-to-day basis. But it seemed clear to me from the outset that the contours of the global economic order had evolved to a point where the US market was simply not significant enough for the US to be able to lean heavily on other countries around the world, let alone China, to unilaterally get its way. And that's principally because over the course of the last 30 years in particular, the US market has slowly but surely slid down the rank order of importance now, as you mentioned, to occupy a little bit less than 15% of the global imports. And that is a substantial fall from where it was in the years after the war, when the United States economy actually was, somewhere in the order of 50% of global GDP. And it was one of the few industrial nations or industrial economies left standing after the destructions of World War II. So the contours of the world had changed a lot. The second reason is that its importance for China has also declined, relatively speaking. This isn't to say that these aren't big markets, but that in the overall scheme of things, proportionately, they become less important. And that happens in large part because trade with other parts of the world grow quicker than trade with the United States. So over time, the trade with the other parts of the world simply become relatively more important than they used to be, and proportionately trade with the United States falls in relative importance. So they are the two fundamental reasons that limit the extent to which the United States can wield its own market as a stick and a carrot. In times past, of course, the US was able to use market access as a substantial carrot. And in fact, a part of its long-standing geopolitical strategy, particularly with its allies, such as Japan and Korea and Germany in particular, was to provide access to the United States market for products made in those countries as part of, firstly, their post-war reconstruction, but also as part of the broader American geopolitical relationships with those countries. That particular setup, of course, has progressively altered as well. So they're the first two main reasons. The third one is that there was a strong underestimation of the extent to which the Chinese economy is actually not as exposed, firstly, to trade in general, which many people sort of forget, and I'm sure we'll touch on that a little bit more detail later, but also that the US market is not that important for the Chinese economy, particularly compared to the case 20 years ago. And it really just means that the United States just doesn't have the leverage that it once did. Probably the one thing that perhaps leads to an overestimation of things, particularly from those in Washington, is a belief that dollars is more important than things. And perhaps the lesson we've learned out of this episode in the last 3 months or so is that, in fact, all around the world, IOUs or promissory notes, which is essentially what US dollars are probably not quite as good as the things themselves.
Right. Yeah, there's one, if we go back, you mentioned a bit of history, is that the pronounced purpose of the tariffs with Trump is that he wants to bring back manufacturing to the United States. Now, and he evoked past times, like the period at the end of the 19th century, which was one of the greatest productive periods in American history, only matched by the period in the 1940s under Franklin Roosevelt's leadership, where the United States became the predominant industrial power in the world. But there is in international relations, of course, this question of mercantilism, that this is a mercantilistic policy of you impose tariffs on foreign products to support your own production at home. And the United States, when it started, like Alexander Hamilton is one of the people called economic nationalists, the first US Treasury Secretary. And at the time, it was correct that fighting with empires and competing with empires, you had to protect your own infant industries and your economy against the British Empire, for example. Friedrich List in Germany, he was also an admirer of the American system. he also initiated the policy which made Germany an industrial nation by this tariff union and supporting. But these are not like directed against others. This is what is called benign economic nationalism, where you care about your own people. You try to develop your own economy. And then there is the malign economic nationalism, which Trump is representing today, is that you want to undermine the others. You want to weaken the others. And you think because it's a zero-sum game, if when the others become weaker, you become strong. But the United States, obviously, as you say, doesn't have the ingredients to bring back the industries home. So because you have discussed many of these aspects, I also written about this, the state of the American economy, like the infrastructure, the levels of skills and the manufacturing capacity and supply chains doesn't exist in the United States as it did in the 1940s or the late 19th century. So that was one wake-up call, because the shelves will be empty and there will be no production happening in the United States. So what your take on that is?
Yeah, look, as I said, I think the realization is that he who makes the things ultimately holds the cards, particularly when they make the cards as well. And there is a big difference between being able to exchange promissory notes or IOUs, or to use the euphemism these days, to swap paper for things, as opposed to being able to have the things themselves. I think that there's a few aspects that are probably worth just touching on in this discussion about American manufacturing. And firstly, in fact, it's probably worth pointing out that America actually does make things. There is a general trope that America no longer makes anything, and that's not entirely the case. The United States remains the world's second largest manufacturer, contributing about 14% of value added in manufacturing globally. Of course, it sits well behind China at about 29% value added, but the United States does make things. What has happened, though, in the last 40 years is that it no longer makes the things that people experience in their daily lives. So the United States continues to make high-end products, aeroplanes and other aeronautical and space-related things. It makes, some of the high-end technologies. It makes medical equipment, and of course, we know that the United States is a significant manufacturer of military devices and equipment. So the United States is not a non-manufacturing nation, but the reason why I think people have reacted over the last 10 years or so in particular to what we would call the hollowing out of American manufacturing is that American manufacturing just doesn't make the things that people experience in their daily lives. And that has had a very important effect on the way that Americans think about their identity and the relationship between the things that they use and the places that make the things themselves. And that leads to, I guess, a form of cultural displacement, which in some regards is probably a bigger factor at play in the politics of manufacturing than the actual act of manufacturing itself. The issue around, bringing manufacturing home, of course, is one in which we now have plenty of evidence from the first round of the tariffs introduced in President Trump's first term. And the evidence is very clear that the effect has been net negative, that the jobs did not come back to the heartland, and ultimately the increased costs flowing through industry into the downstream users of manufactured goods ultimately were paid by consumers, whether they were business consumers or household consumers. So that's really where American manufacturing is today. The tariffs aren't going to work for some of the reasons we've discussed before: infrastructure, skill levels, as well as costs, generally speaking. It's not where America's strong suit is anymore. It has tremendous resources in plenty of other areas, but they aren't the kinds of things that create that strong sense of connection between place and the materiality of everyday life. So that's where I think we're at in terms of the gap between rhetoric and reality, but it's important to remember that there is, I guess, what you could call a cultural or a social affective dimension to structural change.
Mm.
The other issue, of course, in all of this is that the sense of loss that is being experienced and really becoming quite magnified, particularly as political rhetoric intensifies, is that this loss is blamed on someone else. And that someone else happens to be China, who has had a very interesting place in the mind of American elites for a long time. And that position largely is one in which the US has seen China as a place and a people that, in effect, need to be saved. Whether it was saved from a pre-Christian world or be saved from the godless communists, China was a place that needed to be saved. And Americans have, over the course of the last 100 or so years, pursued all sorts of efforts in the name of transforming China. When saving China from the godless communists became difficult, the Americans, over the course of the last quarter century, tried to save China by I guess, creating the space in which the fetishization of money they hoped would fill that void. And if China opened up to the rest of the world through trade, then somehow miraculously that would lead to a bunch of political and cultural changes in China that America wanted to see happen, and none of that happened. In fact, by 2018, Hussein, there was a publication of the Foreign Affairs Journal in which the key topic was, was engagement worthwhile? And the answer from many of the columnists was that the 20 odd years of engagement failed. China refused to change. In fact, one of the articles, I think, described it as Beijing having defied Washington, and that really laid the groundwork for this turn of the political establishment against China, and we are where we are at today.
Yeah, well, I think it is quite lucky for the world that they didn't save China. We have some experience myself. I'm from Iraq. I saw how Americans, Tony Blair and George Bush wanted to save Iraq. We have 20 years of stagnation, and still there's no electricity enough for the people. We are the second largest exporter of oil in the OPEC, but we still can't afford electricity for the people. We have two rivers, but there isn't enough drinking water for the people because all the infrastructure was destroyed, and the American and British, they didn't care about rebuilding the infrastructure they destroyed. We saw what happened in Syria. They tried to save Syria. They tried to save Libya, Afghanistan, and all these examples. So we are quite lucky that they didn't save China. But this is where the thing comes into the place that China today is not what China was before. And that's, I think, the reaction from China for the tariffs is that to shut the door and don't answer or not. Trump thought that President Xi Jinping will call him to beg for a settlement of this issue. The Chinese did not do that. They actually escalated. And then at the end, nobody called back to Washington. And then Washington was forced to call Beijing because things were getting worse. But what made China so strong today to be able to do that?
Yeah. Look, you're right, of course, that there was an expectation that China would buckle and relent in the face of the escalations from Washington. It's quite clear that China had prepared for this moment because China's response was quick. And the response was quick because plenty of work had been done in the months and possibly years leading up to Liberation Day in preparation for just such an initiative from Washington. Some months earlier, you might recall, uh, President Trump threatened BRICS nations with tariffs of 100% and then 150% should they dare trade in anything but the US dollar and move to do things that would undermine the US dollar's status as a global reserve currency. And I think nobody in Beijing was under the illusion that that President Trump wouldn't pursue aggressive tariff actions. They took President Trump at his word, and he made it very clear during the election campaign and in his previous term that he saw tariffs as central to his particular view of how American economic and foreign policy should be laid out. In the years since the first Trump administration, China's economic structure and its relationship to the rest of the world has also undergone significant change. And those changes laid the groundwork really for China's ability to respond in the way that it did. Firstly, it's important to remember that China's exposure to global export markets really peaked in about 2006, when a little bit over 30%, or the equivalent of 30% of its GDP.
Yeah, this is the other thing which surprised me, actually. You wrote the fact that China is not export dependent as it was before, but the more surprising is that you say it already surpassed that stage in 2006. But I mean, President Xi Jinping in the third Belt and Road Forum in Beijing, which I attended with my colleagues at the Belt and Road Institute, in his opening speech, he said, China will only do well when the world is doing well.
Correct.
And when the world is doing well, and when China is doing well, the world will do even better. So it's like this interdependency between China and the rest of the world is so big. But you are saying that it's not really the case that China is so dependent on exporting to the world markets.
No, well, we've reached a position where exports is equivalent to about 20% of GDP value, coming down from a little bit over 30% in 2006. And so, in that sense, it's no longer the export-oriented development model that we saw in the 1990s and 2000s. The model has changed. The other thing to bear in mind is that in terms of how GDP is calculated, which is investment, consumption, government plus net trade, or net exports contributes about between 2 and 3% of China's total GDP. Total GDP. So net exports really doesn't play a very significant role at all in the overall size of the Chinese economy. And what that tells us is that China's economy is predominantly a domestically oriented economy. That shouldn't be surprising. It's a population of 1.4 billion people. It's a substantial market in and of its own right. And much of its resource is committed to satisfying the needs of that market. That's the thing to remember. China's factory capacity has been built in the first instance predominantly to satisfy the domestic marketplace, particularly over the course of the last 10 years. And what's interesting about that is that when you start to think about how particularly some of these newer industries like electric vehicles has evolved, electric vehicles industry has continued to grow, as we know, in terms of total output numbers. And we know, of course, that export numbers also grow because output's growing. But interestingly, the proportion of output that is exported has been declining. And in 2024, the proportion of electric vehicles manufactured in China that are exported is only about 10 or 11%. So 90% or thereabouts is actually absorbed domestically. And that's a function of rising real incomes, which leads to the ability of households to increase their consumption expenditure as well. So it's just important just to understand the difference between absolute numbers and proportions. And of course, in absolute numbers terms, China's a big economy in the world, arguably the largest economy on PPP terms by a long way. And so when China produces things, it is producing things at substantial scale. But in the scheme of China's economy as a whole, its export sector is actually, relatively modest compared to what it was, 20 years ago when the export sector peaked. So that's probably the important thing to bear in mind in all of this. In other words, the consumption gap or the demand gap that particularly the US market in this case represented. So the US market represents about 14% of China's exports. And if China's and about 3% also of its the net position. So if you took the surplus with the United States, it's actually a very, very small proportion of the Chinese economy. And when you have that knowledge that the United States market in net terms really isn't that important, and secondly that you could therefore compensate for its loss through a combination of fiscal measures impacting the domestic economy together with organic growth in your export relationships with the rest of the world, it's probably fair to say that the judgment made in Beijing was that there would be a short-term impact because adjusting to circumstances doesn't happen overnight. And of course, some enterprises will adjust easier and quicker than others, depending on what they make and how mature their alternative market channels are. But there would have been a view, I'm sure, that the Chinese economy and its enterprises would be in a position to make adjustments within 2 years. And some of them would make the adjustments within 6 months and even quicker than that. But by and large, I think that the expectation is that within 2 years, should tariffs remain permanent and the US market is by and large lost, that whatever the losses are will have been fully recovered through a combination of domestic market absorption and organic growth in export markets.
Yeah, this is an important factor in this process of change and the trajectory of change, which people in the United States and here in the EU countries don't really understand, that the world has not sat there and waited for this charity from the United States and Europe that China and all these countries will sell cheap consumer goods to them, and this is how the world economy works. That's not what's going on. One thing which I think is important in terms of even of the our discussion about the Belt and Road Initiative is China has become an exporter not of cheap consumer goods, but is exporting capital goods like machinery, the machinery for global development. And that's mostly to the global south. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China has been exporting capital goods to build infrastructure, transport system, hydropower system, power plants, healthcare, education, all these things, which are not really consumer goods. These things you don't buy in Yiwu, and import. So there's this shift, which is quite important, which means that there's also China has an alternative role to play in the world, but also it has an alternative partnership in the global south. Like I think ASEAN last year, I think, or the year before, surpassed both the United States and the EU as in bilateral trade volume, which almost $1 trillion. China's, if you look at any part of global south, the development has been enormous. China's trade with Africa, China's trade with the Arab world. I just want to give one example to illustrate this. China's trade with Saudi Arabia as one of the largest the largest economy. The one important thing which I have been reporting on recently is that China is relocating lots of industries too close to the markets, like in Africa. Egypt, every week I see announcements that like hire the Chinese home cooler appliances, household appliances production is moving en masse to Egypt, to Ethiopia, to Uganda, to other parts of Africa, because China is not holding to these. China has been more interested in exporting the capital goods, which are crucial for development. But I just give this example from comparing Saudi Arabia's bilateral trade with China, and the Saudi Arabia's bilateral trade with the EU and the United States. Between 2001, in 2001, Saudi Arabia's trade with China was $4.1 billion. By 2022, it reached $87 billion. And Saudi Arabia, of course, is one of the important partners for China in terms of export of development machinery, not only infrastructure, but like recently, the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund purchased bonds in the computer producer Lenovo, the Chinese computer producer, about $2 billion. And these $2 billion were translated into Lenovo building a computer production plant in Saudi Arabia, in one of the many industrial zones. So this is the kind of relationship that China is building to the global South and other countries, which the United States and the EU are completely oblivious to. They have no tools to deal with that because they were holding to technology. China is exporting all the technology, sharing it with others and benefiting both sides. So there is no zero-sum game. The pie is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. There are many pies being produced the whole time. And if Trump thinks that he can, take a big part of the pie, and that the zero-sum mentality doesn't exist in China and the Chinese and the global South. But it's not what the situation is today. But if we look at the future of China's relationship to the global South, that's even more and bigger and more mind-boggling in a sense compared to what we have here in Europe or the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the Arab markets, broadly speaking, in terms of trade with China, have actually grown by about 1,000% over the last quarter century. That gives you a sense of the scale of the change in these relationships. The trade with Latin American market is growing at about almost 8% per annum. And that, of course, is far in excess of the growth in trade with the traditional transatlantic markets. Even China's trade with Africa in the last 12 months grew by almost 5%, which again is substantially more than the rate of growth with the traditional transatlantic markets. Interestingly, there's two other things. I think you mentioned that ASEAN, of course, has become China's most significant single trading partner from a regional point of view, surpassing the EU about 4 years ago. China's trade with RCEP, which is the 10 ASEAN countries together with Japan, South Korea, Australia and New Zealand, is actually about $1.6 trillion now, which is equivalent to the EU plus America and a little bit more joined together. So again, that tells you that the trading relationships, particularly in the developing world, Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa, Middle East, is consolidating and growing stronger by the day. And I think that that's one of the reasons why China was firstly confident that organic growth in its trade relationships with others would contribute significantly to compensating for any loss of the American market. But I think because of that, they were also confident that countries around the world would resist being picked off one by one. So the strategic approach from Washington was to lay out the tariffs on everybody on the 2nd of April, and by the 4th of April or thereabouts, suspended them for 90 days for everyone bar China, thinking that China would buckle. They would then use China's buckling or kneeling as an example to everyone else and then go after everybody. That was the theory, I think. When China refused to buckle and China matched the increases until it became pointless, the rest of the world realized that their best strategy involved 3 steps, actually. Step 1 was to signal to Washington that they were open for talks. No downside to doing that. Step 2 was to prolong the talks for as long as you possibly could, because there was no upside in reaching rapid agreements. And thirdly, and this is the bit that I think China anticipated and actually facilitated in a number of parts of the world, was to rapidly coordinate with others to strengthen bilateral trade and multilateral trade as a mitigation to any future moves by Washington to make people's lives miserable. So in straight down the line game theory terms, this was very easy to anticipate as well, that Washington's hand was weak. It's not like trade data and industrial production data is a secret. It's not like you hold cards that no one else can see. Almost all of this stuff, evidence-wise, is available for everybody to see. It's just a question of how you understand it. And quite clearly, Washington and the analysts that advise Washington and those who are central to this particular policy approach did not view this data in the way that many others, including myself, did, and overestimated the power of the dollar versus the power of the factory. And it's quite clear that the factory won. And now that all that has done, of course, is that it caused Washington to accede to China's very basic point, which is, look, we're not going to talk about any of this until you wind back to the situation on the 1st of April. Right? That's the starting point. And if you do that, then we'll begin to have serious talks, and that's what's happened. So these relationships all around the world. I mean, you touched on earlier the Gulf ASEAN China trilateral summit, which just concluded over the last few days ago.
Yeah, we will have a guest from Malaysia to discuss these three big summits: the ASEAN summit, the ASEAN China summit, and the ASEAN Gulf Cooperation Council summit, which shows you the direction of things in a way.
Yeah, it tells you the direction. Countries, look, nobody in the world takes the view, and I say this notwithstanding the United States, that the world should be divided up into groups of countries that don't talk to others and don't do things with others. Countries around the world, particularly from the global south, actually understand that a better world for everybody is one in which there is open dialogue and open flow of resources where necessary, but in a way that builds capacity. And you talked about China's role as a capital exporter, building capacity in other parts of the world. And that's a very significant contrast at the moment to the United States' strategic priority, which is to take capacity away from the rest of the world and relocate it back in America. Had China insisted on pursuing that policy, it would be, packing up all of its BYD factories, or trying to get BYD to pack up its BYD factories around the world and move them back to China itself. And that's not what's happening. In fact, the reverse is happening. So China is going out. It's building capacity. It's exporting capital goods. It's training people. And importantly also is that it's building national energy sovereignty for the developing countries as well. Once the infrastructure is built, you can't pack it up and take it away. And the good thing about that for the global south and the developing world is that it's there forever, and they will be able to make use of it and benefit from it in a way that is safe from the interventions of others.
Yeah.
And to be energy sovereign is vitally important, and China's fulfilling a very important role, which is to enable countries to become more sovereign in their economic development capacity.
That's very, very important, because I have 3 points. And when I talk to Arab countries, when I do consultancies like that, there are 3 things you have to have within your borders: energy, sovereignty, water. Have enough water for your people, and have enough food for your people. Doesn't mean you produce every food, but to have enough, because many of the countries like Egypt has been under pressure, under the thumb of the United States, because it had to import the daily bread from outside. And the liberal policy, the Washington consensus policy, told the Egyptians, look, you don't need to produce corn and rice. You can get it very cheap from the United States or Australia. Focus on vegetables and fruits, which you can sell for, hard currency in Europe and elsewhere. And that way, Egypt became a hostage to this blackmail for food. And all the problems in Egypt has been, too, the lack of food and the lack of work for the young people. that's the source of all instability in Egypt. Now the government is resolving that and is working with China to do that. And actually now Egypt is greening the desert. That's the way China has been doing. Yeah. And they are producing enormous amounts of corn, and grains in the desert areas. They're developing new technologies. I think Chinese companies are active there as others. And this is the way you get out of this, this idea of sovereignty. It doesn't mean you don't cooperate with us. On the contrary, cooperate, but you don't use food, water, and energy as a blackmail tool against others. So you share technology, you share these things, and you have your advantages. You are good at this, or good at that. That will, things. But this brings us to the question of philosophy, because this Chinese philosophy in international relations and dealing with others is completely different than the Western we have experienced. This zero-sum game, geopolitical. The winner takes it all. There's a limited market and obsession with money. That money is power, and I think this is the big difference. That's why the United States lost, is because President Trump is too fixated on money, and they think that money is power, and money is worthless. I mean, the United States prints money en masse and digital money on all kinds of things. So there's a problem with the philosophy. And the Chinese managed to get this in a different way this time. We discussed a little bit what is here. I mean, it's interesting because much of the book is about avoiding fighting, avoiding conflict. This is the philosophy. If you can resolve a dispute without fighting, that's the best outcome. It's like preventing a disease. But once the disease is there, you have to put enormous energy and effort into curing the disease. So preventive way of doing things. But also there's a factor which I think the Chinese use here is that you know yourself, you know your enemy, you know your strength. And there is one quote which you sent to me, and I would like you to elaborate on that one, that waiting for your enemy to give up is the best is the best tool.
Look, I think it's a general approach to dealing with others where there are conflicts, and it is to recognise that there will always be times where two parties don't always see eye to eye on everything, but that firstly you try to resolve that, and in fact the gap between there being a dispute versus warfare is actually a very big gap, where there are many things that can be explored and done to try to resolve this well before you get to having to fight a war. And so that's probably the first thing. China itself as a civilization has fought plenty of wars in its past, and it understands that the fighting of wars is very costly, and that therefore that it's imperative to be open and think strategically about how to avoid wars and nonetheless achieve your objectives. The issue of waiting for others to fold, so to speak, speaks more broadly to a philosophy of being patient. There are many things in the world that you can't control. Trying to force others to do things is often incredibly counterproductive. And what you are better off trying to do is to firstly prepare yourself, first and foremost, because that is what you can control. Be well and truly aware of the others that you are interacting with, and what their strengths are and what their weaknesses are, and ultimately try to shape conditions in ways that allow the circumstance to unfold in the direction towards a non-confrontational resolution. And that saves energy all round, and you can get on with other things. People pick through Sun Tzu's Art of War to find all sorts of pithy little quotations, but I think that the broad philosophy basically is be prepared for war if you have to be. Don't shy away from it, but nonetheless, there's lots of things to consider as ways of resolving conflicts before you get to that point. And everybody, including yourself, is better off by doing that. And don't forget that you've always got time, and use time to advantage, and be patient. You know, it's quite clear that that Washington seems to at least have embarked on this particular round of tariffs, wanting a wham bam, thank you, ma'am kind of outcome, you know, and almost to provoke instant reactions, wanting to do deals quickly, and that's not what's happened, and it's not how nation states tend to behave. You know, nation states make decisions actually typically quite slowly, particularly decisions that involve changes from what they currently do. Nation states take a long time, in part because they seek to deliberate very carefully about the choices that they make.
You have
Secondly,
also structures. You have to
correct. So there are
well-established structures and methods and techniques and social matters that you can't just flip your, snap your finger and you get the change. And this is
and you have a
just
society. Right?
Mhm.
So you've got your own society to take into account as well, right? So there's all of this stuff. And so I just think that there's just a very different ethos about how to deal with others in the world between China's ethos and that's coming from Washington.
Yeah. This was a wake-up call actually now because the EU are having a big fight with Trump. Everybody is becoming now friendly to China. We see it here in the media. We see it by politicians who are giving interviews to Chinese media. People who attacked China for being an authoritarian a couple of months ago, now they're saying, look, we need to build bridges. I hope this is not a tactical thing, but there are other people who understand this philosophy much better. There was a very interesting study by the Swedish metal industry labor unions, and it said, practically the title was "Thank China for the rise on your salary." And the study says that we actually are benefiting enormously from importing uh, intermediate goods from China, very high quality, but very affordable prices. We incorporate these in our products with our innovation, and we sell them for a very high added value. So China wins, we win. So you have to be grateful that we have this kind of relationship to China. And this is it's a philosophy this the zero sum game doesn't exist in the real world unless you are an empire or you want to, because empires or the British, geopolitics is that you win by undermining others, by pitting others to fight each other, and you sit on top of the whole thing. And that world, I think, is disappearing now. And the physical realities of, the needs of societies, the needs of human beings are taking the center stage rather than what politicians wish to imagine the world to be. And I think this was a very good example with this tariff war. And I hope everybody, as you say in your initial response to Trump's Liberation Day reciprocal tariff things, that besides that it will not work, that there's a place at the table for the United States. And I would say even for, you are in Australia, I'm here in Sweden. We are not, cheerleading China. We are I'm a citizen of this country. I wish Sweden to become, continue to be a prosperous country and contribute to development in the world. And so there is a place for every nation. What we need to change is our philosophical outlook and this culture, which you just mentioned.
Yeah, for sure. Look, it's the world's a big place, and there is a seat at the big round table, and it is going to be a matter of the United States, particularly its political establishment, slowly but surely adjusting to the realities of the world as it is, as opposed to continuing to live in the world as they imagine it to be. And I think this is largely an establishment problem, because the vast majority of Americans, of course, have to, get on with their daily lives and do what they need to do. to earn a living, put a roof over their heads, put food on the table, and if they have children, make sure children are well clothed and well fed and get a good education. And these are the daily challenges that people have. And the vast majority of Americans, I think, are very consumed and focused by the issues that confront them in their daily lives. And but Washington does have a particular culture which has been around obviously a few hundred years, which sees America as exceptional, and in which it has not only an obligation and also a right to intervene in the rest of the world, ostensibly in pursuit of some set of values, but ultimately in the interests of these sort of zero-sum games. And you see this coming again, with the talk around Greenland and the Panama Canal and Canada and wherever else.
The Chinese responded to the Panama Canal by saying, "Well, there will be a Nicaragua Canal. We can dig another canal."
Yeah, and it's also said, look, there are ways of actually ensuring security that actually works for everybody. And this is the philosophical difference too, Hussein, because Western thinking around questions of security are very much anchored by the idea of deterrence. And you do that by becoming stronger than the other person so as to deter them from encroaching on your territory or your interests. In other words, I'm big enough to punish you. What that often does is sets off an arms race. But that's sort of the Western approach to deterrence. Frame an enemy, build up your arms, tell the enemy that, if they overstep the boundaries, we'll do something to you. China, of course, has had quite a different approach, which is that it doesn't go around building or establishing alliances against anybody. And it leads with the idea that my security is only secure when you're secure as well, and vice versa. And that your security and my security can't come at the expense of each other. And whilst that kind of general approach underpins, I guess, a Chinese approach to questions of security, then we are going to see for the time being some clashes with Washington in particular, because Washington doesn't see the world in those non-divisible terms. So there are some philosophical differences that have very practical consequences at the moment.
Yeah,
I'm hopeful, without being overly optimistic, but nonetheless, I'm hopeful that as part of the global reaction to things like the tariffs, that in fact there will be a hastening towards the development of new security architectures that aren't just narrowly military in nature, but which actually are holistic and brings prosperity and peace together as two sides of the one coin, whereby security and economic development are actually symbiotic as opposed to being an either-or choice.
Yeah. Well, that's a very good note to end on. Our very interesting discussion. These are very interesting things. We can discuss them, for hours, which without being tired. But we will leave that for another occasion. But I really, really appreciate that you took the time and with your wonderful insights and your spirit to share that with us. So thank you very much, and looking forward to meeting you again.
It's been an absolute pleasure as always.
Thank you.